Welcome to our CorelDRAW basic session. I'm with Engraving Concepts. This is Jimmy DuBose. We're going to cover some of the very basics of CorelDRAW, and we have several sessions we're going to go through. This is the session number one. To start with, let's talk about CorelDRAW's defaults. Let's say that you have several operators that run your CorelDRAW, and for some reason, some of the features that you normally use have been changed. Or let's say you go to print and something unexpected happens and you can't find what setting has changed. If you hold down the F8 key while you launch CorelDRAW, it'll pop up with this window that says, do you want to overwrite the current workspace with factory default? And if you answer yes, then of course it will go back to the factory default settings. Many times this will actually fix whatever problem you happen to be having. So now let's go ahead and go into the CorelDRAW screen. And we're going to start with covering the different sections of the screen so that we're all on the same page whenever you have a question. So of course, up here at the top, you have the title bar, which shows us the version of CorelDRAW. I'm running CorelDRAW 2019 64-bit. Then you have your menu bar right here. So you have File, Edit, View, Layout. Those are all menu options. Next, you have your icon bar, and your icon bar has several different shortcut keys, like New, Open, Save. You've got Cut, Copy, and Paste. And of course, Undo, which is one of the ones we're going to be using quite a bit when we're doing layouts. And then all the way over here at the right, we also have things like Snap To, where you can go and you can snap to different items. Okay, just below the icon bar, we have what's called our property bar. And our property part is something that's going to change depending upon what we have selected. So right now we don't have anything selected. So it has our plate size. It has, either portrait or landscape. Has what units we're using. It has nudge amount. Has duplication amount. X and Y direction. We're going to cover some of these features in a little bit. All right. On the left-hand side, we have our toolkit. So we have our pick tool, our shape tool, cropping, zoom. Different kinds of drawing tools. So if I actually click on the little triangle to the right, I get a flyout menu that shows me, freehand, 2-point, spline curve, various tools that are under that one option in the toolkit. Of course, we've got rectangles, we've got ellipses or circles and different kinds of shapes. And then of course, our text tool. We're not going to cover the other tools at this point. We're just going to get the very basics in. You'll notice along the top here, I have several jobs. And they're basically like folder tabs going across the top. So you can have multiple documents open at the same time. This is our workspace. You can see that I have a yellow background page. And you can see that this is a 4x6 plate. Down at the bottom, it shows you we just have one page. As we use different colors, you'll see the colors populate on the color palette down here. A lot of times whenever I select different things, it'll give you more information down here at the bottom of the screen. Over here on the right-hand side, we have our dockers. So you can see I have my properties docker, which is basically for text or shapes. Then I have objects, which basically has like layers. We can actually put things in different layers. I also have contour and have a few other items down here. All the way to the right, we have our color palette. Now you'll notice that we're using RGB color palette, which is the preferred color palette for Epilog systems. It doesn't mean that we can't run CMYK, but RGB is the preferred, and it's going to give you the expected results when you laser black and when you laser white in your objects. Let's get over here and let's talk about different ways to select items on a page. So of course, the traditional method with our pick tool, we can just click on something and we can select it, okay? So again, I have to make sure that my cursor is actually right on the object I want to select. If for some reason I was away from it, it ends up selecting the box instead of the text. But if I'm right on that text, it will, of course, select it. We also have basically the marquee select, which is where we drag a box around an object to select it. Okay, so again, I click and I drag surrounding the item that I want to select, and then it selects it. Okay, if you have an odd object, let's say I'm trying to select this inside part here, there's also the lasso select, which is kind of an interesting. So we go ahead and do a freehand pick here. And then what we'll do is basically, I want to start over here, and I'm just going to go around the inside of that object, and then it selects it. Okay, so sometimes if you have a complex drawing and you're trying to select something that is a small piece inside a larger object, that freehand or the lasso select is very, very useful. Another feature that we can use, let's go ahead and let's zoom to page here, is our tab key. If I hit the tab key, it'll actually go through and select different items all the way through my layout. So if you have a hard time selecting it any other way, then you can go ahead and select it this way. Well, what if I want to select multiple items? So if I click on the first item, I hold down my shift key, and I click on the second item, I can have both of those selected at the same time. There we go. And we can select and move those over. All right, and as I told you, our undo key is really useful. We'll go up here to the top and we'll hit undo to put those back where they need to be. Let's talk about setting plate size and nudge. So let's go ahead and let's zoom out. Let's talk about zoom for just a second. So I have my zoom tool right here. If I click on this, I can drag a box holding my left mouse button down, and I can zoom in on an area. If I have zoom selected up here in my property bar, as I said, that changes depending on what you have selected. Well, I have this tool selected now, so it has different options. We can zoom to all objects on the plate. We can zoom to the page. You know, of course, we can also just zoom out a little bit at a time. Now, if I want to just use the actual tool itself to zoom in, I can just drag a box around everything I want to zoom into, and then it'll zoom in the way I want it. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our normal pick tool. And let's talk about some of the other items we have here. So as far as setting the plate size, you'll notice right now my plate size is 10 inches by 8 inches. Okay, if I need to change that, let's say I wanted to change that to, let's say 9 inches, and then I tab down and change it to 6 inches. It changes my plate size as I do that. If I want to change to portrait, I can change to portrait. Okay, so let's say that I'm now going to go ahead and change that back to a little bit larger size. Let's make this 12 inches by 10 inches. And then we'll zoom out a little bit. And I want to place something. I want to place this object in a specific location on that plate. Okay, so first of all, we got to understand how measurement works inside CorelDRAW. If you're looking at this plate size, my origin's the lower left-hand corner, just like you would have it in a Cartesian plane. Okay, so if you look, 0 up here on my x-axis ruler is right here on the left-hand edge of the plate, and at the bottom, 0 is at the bottom of the plate. So let's say that I want this object to be right up against the very edge of the plate. Let's say I want it to be 1/8 of an inch. If you look up here on my property bar, I have different measurements, but it's measuring to a specific origin on that item. So right now it's at the center. That's not very convenient for what I want to do. I want to use the upper left-hand corner of the object. So I just click on that part of the origin, and it'll actually now measure to that point. So if I go ahead and I say, let's say I want it to be 1/8 of an inch from the left-hand side. So let's type in 1/8, and yes, it will do the decimal conversion for me. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead, and you would think I'd type in 1/8 of an inch here. Actually, I won't. I need to type in 9 7/8. So if I type in 9.875, so now this object is 1/8 of an inch from the top of the plate and 1/8 of an inch from the left. So let's say I want to, let's go ahead and move some of this stuff off a little bit. And let's say I want to duplicate this across the page now. So if I select this object, it doesn't have any duplication options here. So with nothing selected, I'm going to come over here and let's say that object is just over 2 inches. See here, it's 2.02. All right. So if I come over and I change my duplication distance to make it duplicate to the right, and let's say that I want it to be roughly 1/8 of an inch between each one, I'm going to type in 2.125. I'm going to select this object, and then I'm going to go to Edit and click on Duplicate. Okay, now you notice that the hotkey on that is Control D. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do Control D again. All right, So now we have 5 of those objects across, and now I want to create rows. Okay, I've already created the columns, if you will. I want to create rows. So I'm going to set my X amount, which is my horizontal, to 0 on the duplication distance, and I'm going to set my Y amount to minus 2.125. I know what you're thinking, well, why wouldn't it be positive? Remember, 0 is down here and 10 inches up here. If I want to duplicate in this direction, I have to use negative. If I want to duplicate up, it's going to be positive. Same thing goes in the X direction. If I want to duplicate to the left, I'm going to use a negative number. Duplicate to the right, I'm going to use a positive number. So let's select this entire row. And again, let's go up to Edit menu and come down and click on Duplicate. And let's use the hotkey Control-D to do the rest. Okay, so if we zoom into the page, you can see that now I have all of these duplicated, ready to go. So that is how you use these values for duplicate distance. Next, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how to use nudge. Okay, so for this one, let's go ahead and let's do like a power switch. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set this to a specific location. So let's go ahead and go to the center on this one. And let's say that I want my X location to be 2 inches, and I want my Y location to be 7.5. Okay, now I've got some text. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the same thing with it. I'm going to set this to the center, and I'm going to set my X location to 2 inches, and I'm going to set my Y location to 7.5. Okay, so let's zoom in so we can see what's going on here. And I'm going to use a feature that is basically is the shape tool in order to change the spacing on these. I want the on to be above this and the off to be below. So let's go ahead and let's click on the shape tool. And you see I have these interesting looking little buttons that are going to control this. I'm going to hold my shift key down, and by doing that, I'm going to keep this centered. I'm going to hold my shift key down, and I'm going to drag this down to keep it centered. And actually, let's see. Now let's keep doing that. Let's go ahead and move it down some more. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to nudge this up. Okay, so the distance that it's nudging, I'm going to click on deselect the object now, and I'm going to come up here, and you can see the distance right here is 30 thousandths of an inch. If I change that to 0.1 and I click on the text again, then I can now, it nudges a greater distance. So let's get the on where we want it. Okay, so let's say that's about where I want it. And then let's go back to our shape tool. And now let's bring this down so that it matches the on. So that looks pretty well centered. Of course, once you get the spacing the way you like it, you can come back and you can change this to exactly 7.5 inches, which is the center of the box. And let's get rid of this, and let's take this text, and let's make this a little bit larger. Okay, and I'm going to use my shape tool again. All right, so let's go to my shape tool, and I want you to see the little squares right here that are before each character. Okay, all right, and right here, these are actually handles for those individual characters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to nudge those up. So let's set my nudge amount. Let's go ahead. Let's use 1/10 of an inch is good. And I'm going to go ahead and click on my shape tool. And I'm going to click on this first one and hold down my shift key. And I'm going to basically come through and I'm going to click on the E. I'm going to click on the R. I'm going to click on the A. I'm going to click on the E again. And then finally the S. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my nudge tool to nudge those up. Okay, it's just for like a really simple visual effect. So this is still text that I can edit. Could you have actually done the same thing with by breaking it apart? Well, sure you could have. but this is now text that I can edit. I can actually go now and I can change this to a different font. And look at the kerning remains the same, the space between the characters. So if I come over and say I do Times New Roman, or I come over and I do Berlin Sans, okay? So that's one of the advantages of making those changes. And let's say that I want more space between the words. Well, that's what that same tool does. I just hold down my Shift key, and now I can change the space between the words. Okay, if I release my Shift key, now it changes the space between all the characters. So that's like inter-character spacing, if you will. Okay, now let's say that I have this text right here, and I want to kind of do a visual effect. I want to mirror this. I'm going to engrave, say for example, I'm going to engrave on the backside of a piece of acrylic. Well, let's say that over here, instead of having my center point origin, I have it over here on the left-hand side, and I click on mirror. You see that basically is like a hinge. All right, well, let's undo that. And again, if I mirror it, it flips on the origin. That's what basically the CorelDRAW is using that origin for. So if I want to flip in place, I have to use center point as my origin, and then we'll go ahead and we'll click on mirror, and we can even mirror in the other direction. Okay, so just let's go ahead and flip this, and let's talk about a little bit of a different tool. We can duplicate a lot of different ways, right? We can actually duplicate using different measurements, but we can also just grab, I'm going to grab this, this handle, and I'm going to hold my control key, and I'm going to bring this down, but then holding the left mouse button down, I'm going to right click. Now what that just did is that gave me an exact copy of that whenever I right clicked it. Okay, so again, let's say I had this object over here, and I click and I drag down, oops, sorry. I click and I drag down and I right click. I click and I drag down and I right click. So basically, just using the right click after you drag something down, as long as you don't release the left mouse button, it'll actually make a duplicate of it. Okay, so let's say that we actually are going to make kind of a shadow with this, and let's say that we just shift this over, and then let's zoom in on it, and it's not touching, right? So let's go ahead and select this object, and then let's nudge it. My nudge is way too large, so let's go and change my nudge amount to 10 thousandths, 0.010, and then let's select my text, and that's not quite right either. Let's nudge it over, and so that it looks more like a shadow. Let's go to our next example. All right, so what I'm going to do on this one is, using some of the tools that we just learned how to use, I'm going to create a chessboard. Okay, so one of the things we didn't talk about is the constraints of the control and the shift key. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create a box. If I hold my control key down, it forces this. So as I click and drag, it forces it to be a square. So I'm going to set this to a 2-inch square. You notice right here that my padlock is unlocked. Locking this ratio will allow me to basically change things proportional. So if I lock that ratio right there and I change this to 2 inches, it actually makes it exactly 2 by 2. So what if I didn't do that? What if that was unlocked here and I changed this to 2 inches? You can see that it basically condenses the box. All right. So again, if we lock this ratio, it allows us to change both dimensions proportionally. So we'll change that to 2 inches. And now I want to put this in an exact position. I want this to be a 1/2 inch from the left. And I want it to be from the top. I want it to be at 16.5, because this is a 17 by 17 chessboard. We're going to fill this. Oh, you know what? I forgot one thing. Actually, I want that to be at 14.5. Okay, want to make sure that we have our squares in the right position. And let's go ahead and fill this with black, and let's turn off my outline. We're going to come into more detail about that, but if you look down here at the bottom, my paint bucket shows me the fill color, and my fountain pen shows me the outline color. All right, now before I go much further, what I want to do here is I'm actually going to hold down my control key, and I'm going to grab this bottom left handle, drag up and to the right, and then I'm going to right click. Okay, so that basically created my two diagonal squares. From this point, I'm going to duplicate over to the right. So let's go ahead and we'll set our duplication amount for Y to 0, and for X, we're going to set it to 4 inches. We'll select those two boxes. We're going to go to Edit menu, and we're going to go to Duplicate, and let's go ahead and duplicate that across. All right, so now we have basically our first two rows. Now we're going to basically create our columns going down. So we're going to set this to 0 in the X, and we're going to select our Y to -4 inches. Again, negative is going down. So we're going to select those two rows, and we're going to go to Edit menu, come down and click on Duplicate, and oops, I shouldn't have deselected, and duplicate down, and there we have our chessboard. Okay. Of course, you could actually, pretty simply, you could just go ahead and engrave this in a piece of acrylic or wood, and you'd have your chessboard, or you could actually set these to be a vector where they would go through and just cut out and do an inlay, whichever works for you. Okay, let's see here. All right, so let's talk about raster versus vector. Okay, so I have two objects here. I have both the same artwork, or started with the same artwork. On the left-hand side, I have a raster image. On the right-hand side, I have a vector image. So a raster image is made up of dots or pixels. As you can see when I zoom in on this, it doesn't create a curve with points and lines. And one of the good things about a raster image is that if I'm trying to laser a photograph, it's the only way to really generate a photograph. So over here on this astronaut here, if I want to laser this photograph, it's going to be a pixel by pixel situation. Okay. If I want to do this artwork that's a vector artwork, then what I can do is I can actually convert it to a vector. Now the advantage of that is that it's fully scalable. This apple on the right, I could do at 1/4 inch tall or all the way up to 12 inches tall, and the quality is going to be exactly the same. On this apple on the left, if let's say, for example, I make it twice the size that it is right now, then my resolution is going to drop. So let's say that at the size it's right now, it's at 100 dpi. If I make it twice the size, my resolution will now be only 50 dpi. So it's not scalable. All right, and that actually the laser will show all of the flaws in your artwork if you're going through and you're lasering this out. It'll actually show this stair step kind of a look if you actually laser this apple large enough. So the other question that we need to ask is, okay, so how does the laser read this as a vector? Let's say I wanted to cut this out of acrylic. How does it read it as a vector? Well, it's all based upon line thickness. If you look right here, this says hairline. But if this was anything thicker than hairline, if you look up here at the top again, if this is anything thicker than hairline, if it's 2 points, for example, this is going to raster engrave. All right, so the cue to actually have something vector from CorelDRAW is the line thickness. So if we set that to hairline, no matter what the color is, this is going to send out to the laser as a vector, and we can use it for cutting. If I want to fill this apple with a color, I would come over here and I would left click on, let's say, for example, gray. Down here at the bottom, it tells me that, hey, this is filled with gray and this has a green outline. If I want to turn off that outline, I can come up over here and I can right click to turn off the outline. Okay, so now this is basically ready to engrave. If I want to set that to black, I could set that to black. And again, if you compare those two, there's really no comparison as far as the quality of what it's going to engrave. The one on the right, which is the vector artwork, is going to be much, much cleaner. Okay, so let's recreate some of these. So let's say that I have a circle. I'm going to hold the control key down to draw a perfect circle. Okay, and then from that circle, I want to create this shape over here on the left-hand side. So what I can do is I can actually hold down my shift key and I can drag this out like this. And I have not released my left mouse button. I'm going to right click. Okay, let's do the same thing in the other direction. So I'm going to hold down my Shift key, select that item. Okay, here we go. And hold down my Shift key and then drag this out and then right click. Okay. Then of course, in order to replicate that, if I click on my inside piece here and I'll left click, change that to yellow and right click and get rid of the outline. And then we'll click on the inside part here. We'll change this to blue, left clicking, and then right click and get rid of the outline. And then of course, we'll do the other oval here, the ellipse, and let's go ahead and left click and change that to red and right click. Well, I have a problem here. I can't see my object. I can't see the inside circle. Well, did it disappear? Well, we can check to see if it did by just going to wireframe. Nope, it's still there. Let's go back to our view and go back to enhanced. And what we can do is we need to basically, we can do a marquee select and select just the inside of that circle. We can go to object menu and come down to order. And we can say, hey, pull that to the front of the page. So it's just simply covered up with the other two ellipses. And there's our artwork. Okay, so let's go ahead and move this off. Let's delete it. Let's say we wanted to, let me zoom out here and move, this is the next example. Let's move this over. And let's say I wanted to actually do a border on this plate. Okay. If I hold down my Shift key and I double click right here on this box, this rectangle tool, it actually creates a box that is exactly the same size as my plate. Okay, again, let me delete this and talk about that again. Hold down my Shift key and double left click on the rectangle tool. Okay, go back to your pick tool, which by the way, one fast way of going back to your pick tool is to hit the control key down and hit the space bar. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Actually, shift space bar. Okay, so we're going to go ahead, shift space bar takes you back. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down my Shift key and I'm going to bring this down a little bit. Okay, let's go ahead and let's zoom to the full page. Okay, so I want to have a border, right? So I'm going to hold down my Shift key again and I'm going to bring in that border. Sorry. Let's do that again, bring it down and then right click. And the border is not exactly equal. And again, I'm just doing this by eye. I'm gonna hold my Shift key down and I'm gonna grab this handle and bring that in. You see it brings the top and the bottom at the same time. And that looks pretty close. I mean, it's still not perfect. Let's go ahead and do a little bit more. Okay, and now I'm gonna select those two together. All right, so what happens if I select those two together and I come over here and I go to fill this object? Let's say I want to fill it with black. That's not what I want at all. Okay, so let's undo that. And what I really need to do is I need to combine these two together. So I'm going to select these two together. And then I'm going to go to my property bar. You see I have combine right here. Okay, so I left click on that. Then I can come over and I can left click to fill that with black. All right, and again, I can right click to turn off my outline. And now I've created a border. Okay, so let's delete that. And let's bring this over. Okay. Okay, so let's say that I have this text at this size, and I come in and I want to put this exactly into this oval. We're going to talk about align and distribute in our next session. Okay, but on this one, I'm going to go ahead and use positioning over here to position things. So I'm going to actually use the absolute position of 3 inches in the X, and I'm going to put 2.5 inches in the Y. Okay, and then I'm going to select Galveston here, and I'm going to give it the same position. So 3 inches and 2.5. Okay, well that's all good and fine, but I want Galveston to take up more of that space inside that oval. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select this, hold down my Shift key, and I'm going to scale it up without it changing position on me. Okay. All right, so everything looks good there. Well, why would you actually do this? Well, I'll tell you what, let's do this. Let's click on Galveston and let's change the color to blue, okay? And let's click on the oval and let's come over and let's change that to black. And I'm gonna turn off the outline. But I changed the blue in Galveston. I just did blue so it wouldn't disappear on us. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna change that to RGB white. So what we have here is actually, it's gonna be raised text. So this text is actually going to be left alone and all the background's going to engrave. So a real simple way for you to create a raised text effect is to basically put some sort of a shape in the background, fill it with black, and then change your text to white. Okay. So right here we have another example. We have this plaque that's been created and everything has been set up the way that we want it. But let's say that overall, I don't really like the size of this. I can highlight this. And again, if I hold my shift key down, I can scale this up, I can scale it down. Okay, and you see that it keeps the proportions of everything with it. So again, let's select all this, hold down my shift key and scale it up. And let's say I want to take up a little bit more of that space. And now, what if I had my origin set over here and I was going to engrave this on some acrylic. I would flip this. See, that's not what I want at all. I don't want to flip off the page, right? So let's undo that. Let's change my origin to the center. Okay, let's get that to the center, and then we can flip the design. And now this is ready to be engraved on the backside of a piece of acrylic. Okay, so we talked about our default color palette that we really prefer is RGB, or red, green, blue. Now, Epilog laser systems prefer RGB, and the reason for that is that if you can actually run a CMYK, but what will happen is that CMYK black will not be engraved as solid black. RGB black will be engraved as solid black. Same thing goes for CMYK white. You would think that CMYK white would not engrave, but on many Epilog systems it actually will, and so you want RGB white. So again, let's talk about changing colors. If I click on this text right here and I want to change the color, I simply come over here and I left click to change the color. That's blue, that's green, that's going to be 60% gray or black, or we can go down to like 20%. If I want the outline to be on, if I was going to cut this text out, then I have to right click. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to right click on red and I'm going to turn the fill off. I'm going to left click to get rid of the fill. So right now, this is at the bottom, you can see here, this is hairline, where you can see in properties right here that this is hairline and this is ready to cut. Well, what if I just want a visual effect of an outline? Let's say I just don't want it filled, but I want to still raster engrave this. If I'm going to raster engrave it, I'm going to change the color to black. So I'm going to right click and change it to black. And then let's change the line thickness. Let's change it, say, to 2 point, or even maybe thicker. Let's go to, let's say, 3 point. So in this case, I basically have an outline of text that's going to raster engrave. So just for a different visual effect. Okay. What about bitmaps? Now, as I click on this bitmap, if you look down here at the bottom of the screen, it shows me that this is a monochrome image. Okay. But what else? It is filled with white, CMYK, which we don't want, and it is filled with CMYK black. So what could happen when you go to engrave this is that this white will actually engrave. You'll see a very light shaded box around your text when you go to engrave. So we want to change those colors. Okay, so fill is always left click and outline is always right click. But with a bitmap, it's a little bit different, right? Because the engraving, which you would normally think would be left click, is actually tied to the right mouse button. So if I came over here and I say right click on blue, you see my A and E changes to blue. All right, but what I really want is I want to change it to black. So I'm going to right click to change that to black. So we're at RGB black is what we want, and that's the first step. Now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to left click to change the background to RGB white. So this is going to engrave the way we expect it. Now, what if you want that background to be transparent? Let's say, for example, this is overlapped on that, and you don't really want to hide that part of that T in that text. But what you can do is come over here and you can actually left click on the slash here to turn off the background. And now that background is transparent. Okay, so shapes. Shapes are the same as text. We can come over here and we can change this to whatever shade we want and right click and turn off the outline. If we wanted to engrave that outline, the same situation. We basically can right click and change the outline, left click, turn off the fill, and we can change it to whatever point size we want that line to be to make it look good. All right, so now I have a shape, two shapes within one another. What happens if I fill those with black? I don't see the star anymore, right? That's because it needs to be combined as one object. So let's go ahead and let's undo that. And with those selected, let's go ahead and let's combine it. And then let's fill this with green. Okay, or whatever shade of color you want to use to engrave this. Okay, so we've covered some of the very, very basics of CorelDRAW in this first session. We're going to cover many more items as we go through the sessions, but this kind of gives you a background and a basic. Thanks for attending this session, and look out for session number 2, which is we're going to cover more topics.